We are learning Maamar, HaYehudim, Tashin Yud Aleph, and it's based on the verse of HaYehudim es asher echal lasos, v'es asher kazad Mordechai aleim. Jewish people accepted upon themselves that which they had commenced to do, but that which they had begun, and what Mordechai had written to them. And that's from the Megillah, and literal is that they established the holiday of Purim, that's where it comes in. But here we're saying, we looked up the Gemara that said what they had begun to do. It's basically that Purim is the culmination of Matan Torah, which is the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. Why? Because between the different opinions, it just seemed that the Jewish people were coerced into accepting the Torah. Either if it's God held the mountain over them, say yes, or you know what, or if it's just even from the Hasidic point that they were so surrounded by love, they're so surrounded by miracles and love and all these things. How can you think straight at a time like that? So any person could have said, hey, didn't willingly go into this. But Purim is when they willingly went into it. Then we ask the question, this question that's asked, it's based on the Maamar of the previous Rebbe. The Rebbe is looking at the Maamar of the previous Rebbe and going through it. We're going to get the recap of it, and then it's going to be, okay, now we have questions on what the Maamar of the previous Rebbe came to. And remember also, we laid the groundwork for it last time. This is said in 1927 Moscow. So the Tsar has fallen, the Bolsheviks are in charge. And the previous Rebbe was making these public declarations about Torah study, specifically Torah study for children. And having Mesiras Nefesh is in going with self-sacrifice to keep Torah study alive, which was a very big no-no for that time. And a couple months later, the Frierdiker Rebbe was arrested. They were going to execute him for treason. Then they ended up exiling him, and then there was a big miracle about it. He was totally let go. But then they're like, get out of Russia. So the previous Rebbe asked the question about what's so unique about the time of Purim, and especially because we went through the different things that at the time of the giving of the Torah, the Jewish people were physically, they were free. So at the height of the physical sense, in that they're totally free, everything was so great for them physically, and then also spiritually, they had reached a very high level. And we see that all the different miracles that they experienced at the giving of the Torah in Har Sinai. Between both things, yes, this seems the appropriate setting for the giving of the Torah. Like, changes everything, the giving of the Torah. Then we have Purim, and Purim seems the exact opposite. It's a time of exile, which in general God is not seen, so evidently in exile, and it's a time of darkness. On top of that, Purim was a especially dark time. They were celebrating that, the Jews are never going to rebuild the base of Mikdash, they're never going back to Israel. Yay, we win. On top of all that, they were also in extreme physical danger because Achashverosh ruled over the entire civilized world. All 127 countries, provinces, there was nowhere anyone could go. That seems like not the ideal setting and not the time of the culmination of what started at Har Sinai almost 1,000 years ago. So what's going on here? The conclusion that the previous Rebbe says is that we have to look something very interesting. Not one Jewish person converted or thought to convert to leave the faith to save themselves. And not just that, but they actually risked themselves to study Torah in public. A very unique situation. So what we come to is that the Jewish people at the time of Purim displayed what we call Mesiras Nefesh, self-sacrifice, that they were willing to risk their own lives to study Torah in public, and to stay Jewish. Tanya affirms that a Jew at a time of spiritual crises, this pilot light flares up within them, they can't separate from God. They will not allow themselves to be separated from God. And then we said not only that, but we made the distinction that Mordechai was the Moshe Rabbeinu of his generation, that he brought out the faith of the Jewish people, and he inspired them to this level of Mesiras Nefesh, who will take this risk to preserve the study of Torah, etc. What we ended up with last time is Mordechai held public gatherings to strengthen the faith, specifically teaching Torah to school children. School children are the foundation of the Jewish people. Now we have these verses from the Megillah, and then we have the Medrash, so Esther Rabbah commenting on these verses from the Megillah. Two parts here. They're both from the Medrash, Esther Rabbah, but they're from different parts of it. The two verses. Vayamar Melech LaHaman, the king said to Haman, Meher kacha salavush v'esasus kasher dibarta v'asechen l'Mordechai Yehudi yoshev b'shar melech al tapel davar mikol asher dibarta. The king said to Haman, hurry, take the garments of the horse as you have spoken, and do so to Mordechai the Jew who sits in the king's gates. Let nothing fail of all that you have spoken. V'ikach Haman salavush v'esasus v'yalbesh es Mordechai v'arkivei b'rchov ha'ir v'kalfanav kacha yaseh le'ish asher melech chavetz bikaro. Haman took the garments of the horse, and he dressed Mordechai and paraded him in the city square and announced before him, so shall be done to the man whom the king wishes to honor. These verses, if you remember in the story, these come in after Haman came back from the first feast, and he's like, oh, look, I'm on top of the world. Oh, look, I'm so special, I'm so important, whatever. Then Mordechai didn't want to bow down to him. You know the whole story how Mordechai had Haman's name on his shoe, that whole thing? Okay, they have history. Mordechai and Haman have a history. Long time ago, something happened, and they were running low on food and water, etc. And Mordechai, being a wise man, was judicious in his water usage versus Haman just like guzzled and like didn't have any left. And he was dying. I'm dying of thirst, Mordechai. Mordechai's like, I'm not just going to give you anything. Basically, he got him to write on his shoe, I, Haman, will be a slave to Mordechai. So it's not just that Mordechai didn't bow down to him. Each time Haman's walking around with his little idol and saying, bow down to me, Mordechai just has to pick up his shoe and be like, who? To whom? To what? So that's part of why he was so pissed off at him, because he reminded him about who owns who. Paraphrasing a little bit, but they have a whole history together. So this comes in where Haman is just so pissed off that Mordechai's not bowing down to him. His wife advises him build a gallows specifically for Mordechai, and you'll make it a massive gallows, and you'll hang Mordechai before you go and attack attack the rest of the Jewish people. This is the Megillah. Haman goes, he builds the gallows, and that night he's so excited he doesn't even wait for the next day. He's going to go that night to the king to tell him about it and get permission so he could just hang Mordechai right away. This part of the Megillah, if you listen, the person who reads the Megillah is supposed to raise their voice. That the king's sleep that night was disturbed. Because not just talking about Achashverosh, it's talking about the king on high. Now's when the stories actually start changing. Everything seems to be so down, now's when the story is going to change. Because it's not just down here the king's sleep is disturbed, but up there. That's that same night that the king Achashverosh can't sleep, and he's like, oh, it must be an unpaid debt. That's what he calls a scribe to read the story. He's trying to turn the pages, and the pages keep turning back to the story of how Mordechai saved his life. They overheard the guards talking about how they were going to poison the king, and Mordechai tells it to Esther, and Esther tells it to the king, and they save his life, Mazel Tov. So that story was read that night. Achashverosh is like, oh, this is why I can't sleep. I have to reward Mordechai. And at just that moment, that's when Haman shows up. And Achashverosh is like, well, that's interesting time. Why is Haman come to me in the middle of the night? Like, what does he think this is? Before Haman could start talking about how he wants to kill Mordechai, the king is, let's say there was someone I wanted to honor so much. What would he do for him? Haman gave himself away in this moment because, well, obviously you have to dress him up like the king and parade him around on the king's horse. Achashverosh says, listen to this. Oh, Haman, interesting. You keep going back to this king stuff. Why are you being so obsessed with the king's clothes and the king's horse? What are you trying to overthrow me? He doesn't say specifically, that's part of what's going on. So these verses come in where he says, okay, exactly what you say, do it for Mordechai. And Haman tried to pull like, do I know a Mordechai? Have we met him before? It's like, okay, stop being an idiot. Go. So he had to go, but you see the way it describes the Megillah here from go and do everything, and it says Haman went and he did. There's a lot of the story that's missing, which is what the Medrash is going to fill in for us. Not just that, but to make matters more exciting, and this is part of the Medrash that I did not include, to make matters more exciting, when Esther heard about, like, oh, there's going to be a whole parade for Mordechai, she ordered the whole city to shut down. Legal holiday! Haman comes and Mordechai's in there, sackcloth and ashes, and Haman's like, okay, get up, we're dressing you when you're going. And Mordechai's like, you can't dress me in the king's clothes like this, look what I look like. And he's like, we can't take you anywhere, all the bathhouses, everything's closed. And Mordechai's like, oh, that's interesting. Hey, tell me something. What was it that your father did? Isn't he a barber? Didn't you work as a barber once before? Isn't that kind of funny? There's no barbers open, but you know how to cut hair, don't you? So basically, Haman had to take care of Mordechai, which is obviously, for him, is very demeaning, but it just shows what a change was going on, that Haman, who thought he's on top of the world, now has to be servicing, cutting Mordechai's hair to get him ready for this whole parade thing. So there's much more in the story that's going on there. Anyways, that didn't happen yet, it's gonna happen soon. But you see the way the Megillah, it only just gives us 2 lines. The Megillah is a very, very abridged version of the story. Okay, now that we've said all this, the part that we're focusing on is here, Mahar kach zalavush v'sasus, bikach Haman es zalavush v'sasus, Haman take the horse and the clothing, etc. Haman went and took the clothing. He went to Mordechai. Mordechai's sitting there with thousands of students, young children, and he hears Haman's coming. What now? What's he coming up with this time? Why is he seeking me out at this point? So he said to his students, my children, run and remove yourselves from here that you are not burned with my coal, as in, don't get consumed in this fire that's coming now, as the wicked Haman is coming to kill me. They said, if you die, we will die with you. So we see that even the young children, the school children, were willing to give themselves up. This goes to the point of Mordechai teaching the school children, raising everybody up to the level of Mesiras Nefesh. The Medrash is telling us that the children are like, we're with you, Mordechai, all the way. So that's one section that it talks about, and here's another section where it talks about this. After he erected the gibbet, so after he puts up the whole gallows situation, he went to Mordechai and found that he was sitting in the study hall with the children, sitting before him, with sackcloths on their waists, engaging in the study of Torah, and they were screaming and weeping. He counted them and found there 22,000 students. Well, 22,000 children. This part of the Medrash says he cast iron chains on them and deployed guards over them. He said, tomorrow I will kill these children first, and then I will hang Mordechai. Their mothers would bring them food and water and saying to them, our children, eat and drink before you die and don't die hungry. Immediately they placed their hands on their books and took an oath. By the life of Mordechai our master, we will not eat and drink, but will die while fasting. All of them began weeping loudly until their cries reached the heavens. The Holy One, blessed be He, heard the sound of their weeping approximately 2 hours into the night. At that moment, the compassion of the Holy One, blessed be He, was aroused, and he stood up from his throne of justice and sat down on his throne of mercy, and said, what is that loud sound I hear that sounds like goats and lambs? Moshe, our teacher, Moshe Rabbeinu, stood before the Holy One, blessed be He, and said, Master of the universe, there are neither goats nor lambs, but rather children of your people who are fasting today and have already been fasting for 3 days and 3 nights, and tomorrow their enemy seeks to slaughter them like goats and lambs. At that moment, the Holy One, blessed be He, took those letters that he had decreed against them that were sealed with mortar seals, and he ripped them. He brought fear upon Achashverosh that night. That is what is written. On that night, sleep deserted the king, and he ordered the book of records, the archives, to be brought, and it was read to the king. The children are weeping and crying to heaven. This is the turning point in the story, where God, he stands up from his throne of justice and he sits on the throne of mercy. And so again, it's the idea that the children were willing to give up themselves for the Torah study, awakened through Mordechai, this level of Mesiras Nefesh. We see this brought down in the Medrash here. Vayikra Rabbah. It's talking here about the Omer sacrifice. The book of Vayikra, which is the book of Leviticus, is not Megillah. It's talking about the Omer sacrifice, the barley sacrifice that they offered. Then we can have the new barley. They're talking about this in the book of Vayikra. The commentary is talking about it, and it actually connects it to the Purim story. So Rebbe Levi said, it was this that stood them in good stead in the days of Haman. As Rebbe Levi said, when Mordechai saw Haman approaching him with the horse in his hand, he said, it seems to me that this wicked one is coming only to kill me. The students were sitting and studying before him. He said to them, get up and flee so you will not be burned in my coal, which we saw. They said to him, whether for death together for life. We are with you and we will not forsake you. What did he do? He wrapped himself in his talis and stood in prayer before the Holy Blessed be it. His students were sitting and studying. So Haman seeing this, and he says to the students, Haman said to them, and what are you engaged? Like, what are you studying right now? They said to him in the midst of the Omer, that the Jewish people would offer in the base of Mikdash on this day. So he said to them, that Omer, what was it? Of gold or silver? They said to him, of barley. He said to them, what was its monetary value? 10 silver kantars. So they said 10 ma'ot was sufficient. So it's a much smaller amount was sufficient. He said to them, arise as the 10 ma'ot of yours has overcome 10,000 silver kantars. Haman tried to bribe the king. Here he's coming and he says, this Torah study of yours of this small amount outweighs all this money that I promised to the king. So that's what it brings in over here. In summary, the giving of the Torah was only the start of the Jewish people's acceptance of the Torah. Acceptance was complete when the Jewish people displayed Mesiras Nefesh during the time of Purim. So what was starting at the giving of the Torah now? So yes, they'll accept the Torah, but it wasn't a full acceptance. Not until Purim, they willingly accepted it. Through the display of Mesiras Nefesh, they proved in action that they're willing to sacrifice themselves for the Torah. That is when the acceptance of the Torah was complete. Almost 1,000 years later, it was finally complete. So according to the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Maamar of the Frierdiker Rebbe is that what was so distinct about it was the Mesiras Nefesh they displayed. The fact that they said, we're ready to give up our lives for Torah, that is what sealed this covenant, basically. That's what sealed the acceptance. End of recap of the previous Rebbe's Maamar. Just remember that the Frierdiker Rebbe is saying this statement publicly in Bolshevik Russia, where he's making these proclamations about how we have to be willing to sacrifice ourselves for Torah study. There were spies there. It wasn't a KGB yet, but from their secret police was there. We see that he was arrested later. Give everything to protect Judaism and Torah study. Now that we have this, the Rebbe gives us this, and now the Rebbe is going to ask questions, and that's going to bring us to a whole new level in this Maamar. So, we have 4 questions. There's text to substantiate the questions, but I put all the text at the end of the questions. Question number 1. The Jewish people completed their acceptance of Torah at Purim because of Mesiras Nefesh. That's the conclusion we came to with the previous Rebbe's Maamar. Why is there an emphasis that Mordechai raised them to this level? The topic is how it was done, not who. Why the added detail about Mordechai's focus on school children? So the Rebbe's question on his father-in-law's Maamar is, we said that the big deal about Purim is the Mesiras Nefesh. That's why we finished what we started at the giving of the Torah. So if that's the whole thing, why do we have this whole section on Mordechai? The point is, what was so special about Purim, not who facilitated everything. The Rebbe is saying it seems this is kind of like a sidetrack to start talking about Mordechai, and not just that, we're focusing on Mordechai and the school children. It must be important that the Frierdiker Rebbe included it, but why is that so important? What is this doing here? Question number 2. Why compare the Jewish people's physical state at Purim to the giving of the Torah instead of only the spiritual state, as that's what's relevant in accepting the Torah? So we understand when you say, look, at the giving of the Torah, they're on this high spiritual levels. They saw what was normally heard. They saw the thunder. They heard the lightning to the point where they expired, and then God had to revive them. So we understand they were at a great spiritual heights. That makes sense. It's a whole spiritual thing. So it makes sense to say at the giving of the Torah, they're on the high spiritual level. Purim time, they're on a low spiritual level. You're also comparing the physical state. No, they're free, and at the time of Purim, they were in a great physical extremes. Why are you bringing that in here? Torah is a spiritual thing. Why is the previous Rebbe focusing on that? Question number 3. Mesiras Nefesh was necessary for accepting the Torah. So he said you have to have self-sacrifice to complete the acceptance of the Torah. Okay, we hear what you're saying. However, it's only one of many mitzvahs. That's part of the text that we're going to get to. The idea that you're supposed to have, that you're supposed to sacrifice yourself for Torah, that there's certain mitzvahs that you're supposed to sacrifice yourself for, rather die to fulfill the mitzvah kind of thing. It's not every mitzvah of the Torah. It's one specific mitzvah to say there are times that you have to give up your life kind of thing. Basically, the idea is, why is this the focus? Further, there's an even stronger connection to living by the mitzvahs. The Torah tells specifically they should live by them. We know there are certain times that the Torah is like break Shabbos to save a life. So we know that living is much more important than this whole idea of sacrifice. We're not into the sacrifice thing. There are other peoples who are into that. And that's not us. We're much more into the living aspect. So how can it be that Mesiras Nefesh is critical for complete acceptance of the Torah? Mesiras Nefesh is only one mitzvah. And not just that, living is a much greater emphasis than dying. It's not about dying for Torah. It's about living for Torah. You say that the only way that we can complete our acceptance of the Torah is if we are willing to die for the Torah. From everything, that's it. We see also, we're going to see the text of this, Moshe instructed the generation entered the land of Israel to say Shema twice daily. Remember we spoke about this in Tanya. It goes to the book of Devarim that he says you should say Shema twice a day. What is Shema? Accepting Hashem as king, even if Mesiras Nefesh is required. You have to love the God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Even if God will take your soul, you still have to love God. However, this refers to the willingness for self-sacrifice, as was surely the case at the giving of the Torah. At the giving of the Torah, they were for sure willing to do that. So they're willing to do it. What makes the act so vital to accepting the Torah in full? It's very curious that from everything you say it's Mesiras Nefesh, that you say that it's self-sacrifice that completes the acceptance of the Torah. And not just that, but this willingness is different than the actual act of it. The only reason why we don't necessarily see the act is not because they chickened out during the giving of the Torah, but that wasn't called for then. It seems like a curious thing that we're focusing so much on this one mitzvah of 613. Question number 4. Purim and Hanukkah are two times in history when the entire people needed to risk their lives to keep the Torah. During both of those, Purim and Hanukkah, everybody was under the decrees of the time. So what makes the Mesiras Nefesh of Purim so unique that it completed what was begun at the giving of the Torah? Which is kind of, we've sort of been saying this question of what makes Mesiras Nefesh so unique, and specifically Mesiras Nefesh of Purim. Specifically at the time of Purim, when the Jewish people were willing to give up their life for Torah, there's something distinctive about it, that's why it completed everything. Now, we're going to see a bunch of verses that substantiate all these questions, and then it's going to be the bulk of the Maamar, going through a whole thing about Torah study, mitzvahs, and the different dimensions that are at play here. And by the way, just to give you the thing about question 4 about Purim and Hanukkah, historically Purim was first. But it doesn't take away the question of that there's something distinct about specifically the time of Purim, that they're Mesiras Nefesh, that's why we completed the acceptance of the giving of the Torah. We'll give you one verse. This is from the book of Vayikra. Ishmartem es chukosav es mishpata asher yasa osam hadam v'chai behem. Ani Havaya. I like writing Havaya instead of Hashem because you guys now recognize that there's a difference between the different names of God. If it says Hashem, it's because that's what the original text said, but if it has God's name written out there, then I'll make sure to put in Havaya when it's Havaya and Elokim when it's Elokim. You shall observe my statutes and my ordinances, which your man shall do, and live by them. I am Hashem. We're bringing this verse first and foremost of V'chai behem, you shall live by them. By the way, this is part of where we get the idea. How do we know that you're supposed to break Shabbos to save a life, etc.? And how do we know that saving a life comes with everything? So we know that, but it's also V'chai behem, you're supposed to live by them. That's a guiding light for rabbis in trying to decide certain things. We have to make sure that we have to live life. So you should live in them. Again, we have it straight from the Torah that you're supposed to live by them, so why is there such an emphasis on giving up your life for Torah? Why is that the completion of the Torah? Right? If I think it should be the time of the greatest mitzvah that they perform. This is what the Maamar is going to be about.